When the Clemency Board was disbanded in the summer of 1975, I returned to my old job at the office of the General Counsel of the Veterans Affairs Administration. But after having been back at the VA a few months, I began to feel like a pawn in a game over which I had no control. Sometime after the first year, Tom Downing, the congressman from Virginia's 1st Congressional District, unexpectedly announced that he would not be seeking re-election. I had been keeping an eye on Congressman Downing's seat since Tiny Hutton's surprise visit, but his announcement in early 1976 caught me, most of the political junkies around the state, and even Tiny Hutton himself totally unprepared. So here we go. We're going into a political race here. And the guy he's going to end up running against is a guy named Paul Tribble. And he starts gathering some intelligence on Paul Tribble. I discovered that Tribble, who was 1 year younger than I, had obtained a medical deferment from his local draft board that insulated him from any of the fallout of the Vietnam War. I had no doubt that Paul Tribble, who was now loudly proclaiming the necessity of a national defense second to none and a hard line towards communism, had engineered a questionable deferment to avoid the war that had killed a dozen of my friends. Yeah, he said it was something about his range of motion in his arms or his elbows or something is why he was deferred the draft. This is an interesting thing. So now he's starting to spin up and starting to go forward in this election. Back to the book. Many of the people with whom I conversed were unequivocal in their belief that Paul Tribble was making all the right political moves and, as an incumbent, would be difficult to beat. Nevertheless, I was undaunted in my enthusiasm to take him on. And like many political novices, I paid more attention to the encouraging words I heard than to the discouraging ones. I knew in my heart that I could not get an accurate reading of my own chances until I entered the race. So that's a very important thing to think about. Is that, and I skipped through the book a little bit, but I think Lou had taken 2 years. The guy gave up the seat. This guy Trimble had won, and Lou didn't run against him. Now, 2 years later, this is when he's running. So that's why the guy that he's going against Trimble is an incumbent. But it's just interesting that he would listen to the people that were telling him, yeah, you should do it. And anyone that was telling him, hey, look, the guy's an incumbent. The guy's got a good politician. He's got a good base. It's not smart. He didn't listen to them. The only, what's that kind of bias? You always talk about these biases, right?
Confirmation
bias.
Basically,
it's confirmation bias. He's hearing what he wants to hear. So Toddy and I began to assemble a staff to formulate a campaign plan and began raising seed money. So there we go. It's on. He's running. I thought the contrast between Paul Tribble's background and my own would speak for itself in terms of our respective sacrifices. He, however, proved far more adept than I at wrapping himself in the American flag, and the local media never once in the course of the campaign made any reference to the circumstances surrounding his draft deferment. I came face to face with Paul Tribble for the first time in the early spring of 1978. In his early 30s, with blonde hair, a light complexion, and almost delicate features, Tribble appeared even younger, although he and his wife worked the tables around them like seasoned professionals. I could see no evidence of any disability in either of his arms, and from the way he was shaking hands and slapping the backs of diners around him, he apparently had rehabilitated himself quite well. So, he's very suspect of the guy skipping out on the Vietnam War. On one occasion, a local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, and I again, this is all in the book, but he's a very savvy political player, Tribble, and he's got very good relationships in a bunch of different areas, including the press. So the press reports things, they'll report what Tribble does, and they won't say anything about, and he's getting, it's a tough campaign, and Tribble's a professional. He's doing a very good job. And this is one situation. He's got some friends at the Veterans of Foreign Wars. On one occasion, a local Veterans of Foreign Wars post gave him its Man of the Year award, and I was invited to the banquet where he was to be honored. I accepted on the condition that I would be recognized and allowed to speak. But after I arrived, it was obvious that there had been a misunderstanding. Tribble, who was seated at the head table, was the center of attention throughout the evening, while I was seated at the back table. After the meal was concluded, he gave his standard speech on national defense and then had his picture taken for the newspapers as he accepted a plaque from the post commander. My recognition consisted of having my name read from an alphabetical listing of invited guests in the room, and I was not permitted to do anything more than raise my hand when named. In a room full of summer soldiers and sunshine patriots, I was probably the only man who had ever experienced combat or shed blood for his country, and they gave their highest award to a boy who did not even meet their own lax requirements for membership. And this is burning him up. His campaign. So this is, again, this is all detailed really well in the book, and it's actually interesting because to hear a little bit about the behind the scenes of a political campaign. It's all in there, all the things that go on in a political campaign. And his campaign manager is a guy named Dennis, and they're finally getting towards the end. It's like the last week of the campaign, and they're having a little sit down. And his campaign manager says, Tribble's ahead with solid support in every area of the district, he said, pointing helplessly at the tangle of papers on his desk. I'm going to run a negative ad attacking him for taking so much political action committee money, but at this point, it looks pretty hopeless. So his campaign manager says, look, we're going to run some negative ads against him. Back to the book. I nodded my understanding, and for an awkward moment, neither of us said a word. Finally, I put my hand on his arm and told him that it was important that we ride out the remainder of the campaign with the dignity that we had aimed for. As I prepared to leave, he handed me a letter from a contributor and told me that he had been saving it for an appropriate occasion. So, Lou Puller's like, I'm not going there. We're not going to go negative. We're going to keep the dignity of the campaign. And then he gets handed this letter. And the letter, which had been mailed in Florida, was from a doctor who had treated me when I was brought in from the battlefield in Vietnam. Never, he wrote, had I seen more severe traumatic injuries in a patient who had lived. And I wondered at the time if I was doing the right thing by allowing you to live. Your survival had seemed to me a miracle of dubious value, which severely tested the moral imperative of my Hippocratic oath. Your running for the House of Representatives 10 years after our meeting in Vietnam reaffirmed the worth of my service and is a source of great personal satisfaction to me. Pretty powerful. So then we get to Election Day. Election Day, with one precinct reporting, I was in the lead. And for an instant, a flicker of hope stirred inside me. Tribble quickly took the lead as other precincts began reporting, and I watched in fascination as my slim lead became a rout. And I think I looked at the results of the election, and Tribble beat him with 72% of the vote, so it wasn't even close. The morning after election night, I awoke with a hangover, having stayed up half the night drowning my sorrows.